welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. This episode is powered by Dr. Ray Gorman, founder of Engage Movement. Learn how to boost your income without relying on sessions. Get a free training on the blended practice model by following at Ray Gorman DPT on Instagram. Today I'm joined by Eugene Tsovik, physical therapist and Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and we're going to be diving into a variety of performance and rehab considerations, in particular for Jiu-Jitsu. This is a great episode, and I highly recommend you check out everything Eugene is doing in this space, especially if you're a PT or rehab clinician that's working with Jiu-Jitsu and martial arts athletes. Enjoy. Eugene, welcome to the podcast, man. I'm super excited to chat with you today. For people who maybe don't know about you or your backstory or the podcast you host or all the incredible things that you've been doing, in particular in the martial arts space, would you mind filling in a little bit about who you are and all the great things that you do?
Yeah, my name's Eugene Tsovik. I'm a doctor of physical therapy and I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt. I've been practicing since 2010 as far as physical therapy goes. And then I started jiu-jitsu actually while I was in physical therapy school in 2008, 7, 8, somewhere around there. Time escapes you after this many years. But it was kind of interesting thing. Like I kind of got into it. I had a buddy that wrestled in high school that I knew, and he's like, I coach at this gym. And so he's like, you should come by. And then I just ended up stopping in one day and training, and that's where it started. So I've been doing it since 2000, I guess, 8. And it's kind of funny how you start those two things together, like physical therapy school, and then like the inverse of that is jiu-jitsu. Like you're putting people together, trying to fix them, and you're like in jiu-jitsu, you're kind of deconstructing and figuring out how to break things, I guess. You don't want to hurt your training partners, of course, but that's kind of it's kind of an inverse idea, but they both work very well together, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that for a second. Is that overlap between starting jiu-jitsu and starting PT school at the same time? I'd imagine there's a decent amount of carryover there to your point about one being the destruction and one being the kind of rebuilding, if you will, that way. I think
Yeah.
the anatomical considerations and some of the other like overall joint considerations from PT school probably bled over really well into jiu-jitsu that way.
They both help with an understanding of the other. It's just in PT school, it's just like you're just getting overwhelmed with information and you're trying to learn so much so quickly and not just learn it, but also be able to utilize and understand how you can apply it. And so, that like knowing the anatomy was so helpful in knowing like the mechanics of a jujitsu movement or technique. Again, so much information, so many details in both aspects, both realms. But it was very, I think I didn't see the two really. They're both very separate when I was in school because there wasn't anybody really doing the rehab for jujitsu space. So I never saw them as like something that I could blend together, but they did correlate together so well. And that was just something that kind of came out naturally. And actually, thanks to my coach, I started treating in the gym and started treating some of these jiu-jitsu athletes. But I would have kind of not really put it together, I guess, initially.
Yeah, yeah, it kind of takes a little bit more time to get to that conclusion that way. And I mean, I think we talked about it before how guys like you and Mike and different ones that way were kind of some of the pioneers or trailblazers, in
Yeah.
my mind, anyways, about the rehab for the jiu-jitsu athlete space. Is in my mind, this is a population that was grossly underserved for a prolonged period of time. Obviously, the injuries are can be pretty extensive and
Yeah.
gruesome that way. And obviously, like there's certain things like, if you do jujitsu long enough, you're probably going to get your ankle popped. Like there's certain things within the sport that I feel like are going to hurt and you're going to have to be able to recover and bounce back from them relatively quickly. But, I've noticed this stigma with a lot of the athletes that I've worked with that train jujitsu or really any martial arts discipline where like they hate going to the doctor because they don't want to be told just rest for 6 to 8 weeks. They want someone who's actually able to kind of work with them a little bit more fluidly and say like, hey, look, you might not be able to do X, Y, and Z right now, but you can still do this or you can still do that and kind of work in a more like martial arts minded manner, if you will. And I find that's something that a lot of clinicians are lacking or struggling to develop, if you will.
Yeah, you have to have a pretty deep understanding. So I see, not to be critical, but I see some people getting into the space that maybe are white belts or blue belts and don't quite have a deep understand. They are physical therapists, and they don't quite have a deep understanding of jujitsu, the intricacies of some of the techniques, and really, I think you get to understand as you're in it for a while the mindset of some of these athletes, and they're a unique breed. They're willing to sacrifice a lot to be on the mats, and sometimes they think short term instead of longevity. And that's the thing you want to, unless you are like, hey, I'm gonna be in the world championship. My knee's really messed up, but this is my once in a lifetime opportunity to win this huge world title. But most people are not in that realm and they're not in that space. So you want to be a you want to be somebody that can do this for the long term. And jiu-jitsu is a sport or a martial art that I feel like has longevity in it if you want to find it and seek it out and promote that longevity into your practice. Like the thing is, a lot of people like find jujitsu, and there's not just one thing, but there's multiple things about jujitsu that's so addicting to people, and it's all they want to do, and they don't see maintenance work, mobility work, strength conditioning work as an adjunct to jujitsu. That's something that can help them, number one, be better on the mats, be injured less, have better performance. Like who doesn't want to be stronger? Like there used to be this stigma, and as the marketing with jujitsu was like, you can be the little guy, the weak, frail guy or person, and you can defeat the bigger opponent. Well, if you have jujitsu and I have jujitsu, but I'm stronger than you, I'm better conditioned, I'm gonna win. Like if our jujitsu is like equal, I'm gonna win. So like you have to start looking at those things, you know, as an adjunct, as part of your jujitsu, not as separate. Kind of like when I first started, I saw physical therapy and jujitsu as these two separate entities. They're really interrelated. And I think like when you look at strength conditioning and mobility and rehab work as a part of your jujitsu, you're gonna and change your mindset, you can really improve your performance. You can improve jujitsu, the quality and the effectiveness of your jiu-jitsu. And also, you're not going to get injured as frequently. You're not going to be off the mats as frequently, which is what people don't want. They don't want to be off the mat. So by doing those things, you're keeping yourself on the mat. And if you do have a little injury, you could probably work around it or work, with someone, like you said, Mike or myself, or someone that's in the space that understands grappling and understands rehab, that can get you to still be on the mats in some capacity and not get hurt worse, essentially. So that's the main thing, right? We don't want somebody to come back too soon, get re-injured, or not be at their best, and then they're more vulnerable to injury. There's no way to avoid injury in jiu-jitsu. I mean, you're going in there to try to move joints in ways they're not meant to be moved, and there's injuries will happen. There's a lot of factors and variables that go into it, but there's things that you can do that are in your control and in your wheelhouse that you can hopefully protect yourself and build longevity into yourself.
There's certain aspects that are similar to other sports in the sense that there's always a risk of injury and there are modifiable risk
Always.
factors. There's things that you can be
There you go.
doing to prevent them or, significantly reduce your likelihood of those things happening. But there are other things that are, just involved in the sport, right? Like a lot of Americans watch football. You throw football on and you see a 300-pound lineman blow up a dude half his size. Like that's part of the sport. It's gonna happen. We accept
100%.
that. There's certain things in jiu-jitsu that are going to happen as a result of the sport. And to your point, selecting the right provider is certainly essential that way. And that's where I know you and Mike have been doing great work to kind of develop this like network of individuals and teach other individuals and clinicians like what to look for and what to even do as a clinician that way. Because
Yeah.
obviously they don't teach you rehab for special populations like the jiu-jitsu athlete in school. So being able to provide those resources, I think, goes a long way. And
Yeah.
understanding too, if you're the jiu-jitsu athlete, like you can choose who you work with. You can certainly kind of fire your rehab provider and pick a different one that way. And obviously that's getting easier and easier with the online space nowadays as
Right.
well, with guys like you and Mike out there that way. I'm really interested though. You brought up some different points like mobility work, strength and conditioning, recovery, and all of these different things for the jiu-jitsu athlete that way. Starting with that mobility piece, What do you kind of view that mobility for the jiu-jitsu athlete to look like? Because I've heard of a lot of different approaches to that quote unquote mobility training. And personally, I think this has huge potential, right? You give the joint more degrees of freedom, you open up new possibilities to solve the movement problem that is being kind of demanded by the sport of jiu-jitsu that way. What does that kind of mobility for jiu-jitsu athletes look like in your mind?
The jiu-jitsu athlete has some weird mobility quirks. We'll just say it that way. So there's some things that they will have abnormal mobility in, like I would say, for example, the hips. Jiu-jitsu is a very flexion-based sport, and hips are very important. We're rounded a lot of times. We're pulling things in, we're keeping everything tight. So for the hips, for example, external rotation, you have to have probably a little more external rotation than the normal person, just because of guard retention, certain positions, and internal rotation is important as well. But having that rotation is very, very important. That's one thing. And you have to have good control of your joints. You have to have good awareness of where your limits are as well, not put yourself in certain positions or try to avoid certain positions. Inversion's a big thing. A lot of guys invert, and what people don't know, inverting is kind of going almost like upside down onto your shoulders. You're not supposed to be really on your neck, but you're kind of going and kind of rotating underneath maybe your training partner or your opponent to get into a leg lock or get in some kind of entanglement. So you have to have good mobility in that flexion realm. You have to, but you also, outside of jiu-jitsu, you have to work the opposing areas, and you have to try to, quote unquote, I don't know, like necessarily saying rebalance things, but you have to work the other muscle groups as well. That's where kind of the rehab or the other aspect comes in. But the mobility piece is so important. And a lot of jujitsu is rotational. We have rotation. There's not really a neutral spine in jiu-jitsu, right? Everyone's like, neutral spine. There's no neutral spine in jiu-jitsu. You're flexed, you're rounded, you're curled up, you're side bent, you're rotated at times. You have to have good stability, good control in all those planes, and you have to have good mobility, but also good control at end ranges. You have to close the gap of like passive range of motion and active range of motion. It has to be the smallest possible, and then you have to be able to recruit muscles at those end ranges. Some of the training that I did was the functional range conditioning, like FRC, and then the internal strength model with Dr. like Andrea Spina and all those guys at functional anatomy seminars. That's a lot where my training, I started to really learn and utilize a lot of that type of training, which is, a lot of isometrics and end range control and building strength at those end ranges and strengthening at length. Dr. Spina always says strength, you want to work at length and to length. So at the length, that's where your muscles most of the time are most vulnerable, right? When you're all the way extended out or all the way rotated and there's nothing else, that pure tension is on that joint and that capsule and all that tissue. So you have to have good awareness of what your capacity is and also have good control there. You don't want to just have a ton of passive mobility that you can't control, and then somebody puts you in an Americana or a shoulder lock where maybe either you're extra rotated or internally rotated, to the maximum, and you have no control and no strength there. That's a problem. So the rotational training is very important in jiu-jitsu, and that's something people don't do a lot of. They do a lot of push pull, things like that, but we're not doing a lot of rotational work, and a lot of injuries and a lot of these things that occur in jiu-jitsu are rotational in nature, and that really needs to be trained. And that's kind of some of the stuff that I really utilize and I focus on. If you need mobility, we work on creating more space in that joint, more mobility, and then we follow that up with control. If you need more stability, let's work on, some end range isometrics, good control at those end ranges. So it just depends on what you need. And you have to understand the positions in jiu-jitsu, number one, that you're going to get into. And then you got to figure out, okay, how do I train those positions to keep myself safe and also have more tissue, more activation there to support myself. Whether it's not just like I'm telling somebody, oh, get put in a submission, an Americana where you're all the way extra and rotate. Don't get put in the submission, see how long you can take it. It's more like, okay, I'm in trouble here. I have maybe a split second that I can protect my shoulder and tap, or I know I'm in trouble. I'm more aware of that range, and I'm going to be able to hopefully tap out quick enough to where my shoulder doesn't get destroyed. Those are some of the ideas that we kind of work on. I mean, building mobility if it's needed, building stability if it's needed, creating both. And then also your traditional strength conditioning is very important, push, pull, legs, that kind of, you're doing that stuff as well, that stuff's very important. You got to be able to do those things as well. And I think a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes either A, don't understand that, or they've been told that that's not something they need. And they use some of these examples of some of these legends in the sport that have been able to get away with not doing those things. But they're few and far between. And the everyday regular person needs strength conditioning and that kind of mobility work, especially as you get older, especially as your joints keep taking this abuse, through jiu-jitsu, because they will, even if you're not getting severe injuries, but you're getting these tweaks constantly, and all this stuff adds up over time, and it can weaken the tissue and damage the joints. And we want to try to prevent that or mitigate the risk as much as possible.
100%. And the one thing that I find unique about jiu-jitsu is, to your point on longevity that you made earlier in sport, I've seen teenagers practicing jiu-jitsu. I've also seen people in their 50s and 60s practicing jiu-jitsu. And to your point on joints, they move and function a lot differently when you're 15 versus when you're 60 years old. So
Absolutely.
making sure that you promote the longevity, not just in the sport itself, but also for the actual joint health, I think is absolutely essential. And I love your concept too about the end range positions, because you're right. I certainly see a lot of injuries occurring in those positions, right? Like, I think a lot of people look at like that shoulder position that you were talking about, and they might in their mind think of like a sport like baseball when the pitcher's in like maximum layback that way. It's like
Yeah.
that's where you see injuries potentially occurring. You don't see it in the mid range the majority of the time. Same thing at the knee, right? Like the classic one that comes to mind is the ACL and that like excessive hyperextension moment. And it's like, well, if you have the hyperextension range passively, but you have absolutely no active control and no strength there, that's a huge risk factor
Yeah.
in my mind for injury. And being able to close that gap, like you mentioned, between the passive and the active is essential. And I think the two go hand in hand. I've certainly seen a number of different individuals that way who have very, very restricted passive movement, and I'm barely getting 10 to 20 degrees in hip rotation. And
Mm.
we're lucky to flex to 100 degrees hip flexion. But as we start to open that up, we have to follow it with something active, or else it's just going to be us doing the same passive stuff week after week after week, wondering why we're not actually getting anywhere. It's like, it's not enough to just go in and improve it passively. It's like we have to kind of hit it with our WD-40 and our duct
Yep.
tape to make sure it
Yep.
sticks around a little bit longer.
Yeah, you have to activate the tissue. Now you're getting a new range of motion. Your body's not used to this new range and doesn't know what to do. And if all you do is just create more range of motion and then don't follow it up with some kind of stimulation, activation, and strengthening, you're not going to keep some of that. I mean, you may passively, but then that's also dangerous. If you've got, some people that are very much like Gumby and they're very flexible, but they don't have a lot of control and stability, you can also get hurt. And that goes with a lot of, you talked about, we have quite a spectrum of athletes. You have young kids starting at 5 or 6. My kids trained off and on, they started when they were like 6. And then you've got people in their 60s and even 70s that train. The thing is that I try to really educate some of the younger kids and the parents, like, don't let your arms keep getting hyperextended and pop when you're 10 years old, because when you're going to be 20, 25, you're going to have some issues. You're going to create too much laxity and too much damage, and that's cumulative. So I really try, I do some refereeing. My coach Chewy runs the Jiu-Jitsu Open, and I'll do some refereeing, and sometimes I'll get the kids that are like 12 and under and stuff, and I tell the parents and I tell their coaches, I'm like, if I see that arm and it's extended and I feel like they're not getting out, I'm stopping it, even if the kid doesn't tap, because these kids are super tough and they will eat that and they will not tap. And I stop it. And sometimes the coach will walk up to me and say, "He didn't tap." I said, "No, it was my call." And I was like, you know what? And I don't feel bad about it. And I tell him, I said, I would feel bad if I let the submission go and the arm got broken or something got damaged. I would feel bad then. If I stop it early and there's no injury, I don't feel bad about that. That's my call. I'm there to protect, those kids from getting injured, because it's a tournament and those kids are coming to win and they're tough and they've been training hard, and it's important to them, and I want them to stay safe, and I want them to understand it's not the end of the world either if you get submitted. You got a tournament next week if you want to do it. And it used to not be like that. There wouldn't be tournaments every weekend. Now there's tournaments everywhere. You got plenty of places to compete. You just want to, learn and move on and protect some of these kids because it's starting to become where kids are getting into jujitsu specifically for jujitsu. Like they're training, literally being homeschooled. You'll see it now. There's like, for example, the Ruotolo brothers are two twins, and they're probably in their 20s now. They're two of the best jujitsu athletes out there. They're starting to fight MMA. They're incredible, and they started when they were little kids, and they've trained basically to be jujitsu, I mean, phenoms, and they are. And now you're seeing more of these kids, and they're so high level at such a young age. And so you have to try to protect them so that when they do get to be 18 and 20, and it really starts to matter when in these black belt adult divisions that they're going to be able to, their body's going to hold up.
Right. I mean, the sport itself, as you've alluded to, is really growing in popularity over the
Huge.
past
Yeah.
several years. It's exploding, which is great. But to your point as well, if there's not that longevity component to the sport, how long will that continue to grow? Because obviously, we both want to see it grow and flourish. But, if a stat comes out or a study comes out that 50% of kids, I'm just making that number up, that do jujitsu, like, end up with X, Y, and Z injuries, or they can't do this at a certain age, like, people are not going to want to put their kids into that. So I think that protective element, like you alluded to, is absolutely essential that way. And the other piece too is that sports specificity piece. That makes the things you mentioned before on the joint side and also just getting into extended positions and the opposite positions that the sport puts you into that much more important. We see it with other sports all the time. We talk about early sports specialization being great for skill, but maybe not the best for certain other things in life. And
Yeah.
it's like, just because we're getting really good at the sport doesn't mean we, completely abandon some of those other general qualities that might carry over to other things in life that
Yeah.
we have to do.
It can be dangerous. It can be dangerous. And you're seeing, for example, a perfect example is baseball, right? And you get a lot of kids injuring their shoulders or having Tommy John surgery or at a very you're seeing this prevalence and it's just the overuse. It's these injuries. Yes, you're getting your kid better at this sport, but what are you doing for them? Are they going to, when that really matters, maybe when they get to the point where they could be very high level, is their body going to be together? Is their body going to function like they need it to, or are they just going to be chronically injured? And also burnout. I mean,
Yeah.
burnout's a real thing. Like jujitsu is amazing and it's fun and I love it. But like, man, if you get people into it and they just that's all they ever do and they're training multiple times a day, they can get burned out. You want to keep it fun for them at a young age as far as kids go. But there's an addictive nature to jujitsu. There's something that's like, man, it feels so good to learn a technique and literally get that instant feedback. We're going to go roll and I'm going to hit that technique on you. And I hit it and it worked. Damn, that's pretty cool. That's the thing. Like when I started jujitsu, I was like, I learned to, I think I might remember my first submission. I don't, maybe it was a triangle or something, learning a triangle choke. And I remember hitting it for the first time. I was like, oh shit, that worked. That's crazy, It's the wildest thing and like because you can apply it right away and you can literally test it right away. You can go to a tournament and test it. You can literally test it at practice. And it's very intriguing and it's very like stimulating. You're like, "Oh shit, I want to do that again. That felt awesome."
Yeah.
And it's just instant feedback. And jujitsu is so cool that there's that element of instant feedback and problem solving. A lot of other elements that go to it. Obviously, you get in better shape if you show up and you train hard, and you're going to get in better shape and get better condition. But you're also going to feel a little better about yourself. You're not going to you're not going to be as, for me personally, I was very afraid of confrontation as a young kid. And I'd probably say I'm still afraid of confrontation as an adult. I don't ever want to come, but I feel confident that if I do get in confrontation with somebody that's, doesn't know jujitsu, I'm going to pretty easily be able to handle them and keep myself safe and my family safe and maybe other people if that's, if that's something that it comes to. And that's also something very empowering about jujitsu, for men, for women, for kids, things like that. I think it's a very interesting element. And so I've kind of been thinking about like, why is jujitsu so addicting? Like, why do people like they get into it and they're like, that's all they want to do every day, and you see it. I see it in the gym all the time. People show up and like, I'm like, how many days a week are you in here? I'm like, every day, twice a day. I'm like, you can't, you got to rest. Your body's not built for that. It's not adjusted to it yet. And that's a dangerous component of jujitsu as well, because everybody gets really into it, really addicted. So
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the instant gratification that you get, like you mentioned, when you do hit those
yeah,
skills for the first time. Like it's an addicting kind of feeling and you want more of it, but it also has this delayed gratification element. So I think the combination of having both is unique, and not many sports have both instant and delayed. And what I mean by the delayed is just like take a look at how long it takes you to like level up in the belt system that way. Like it probably took you over a decade to get to the black belt. And it's like,
yeah,
you don't get there overnight. So you're working towards something, a bigger goal, but you're also celebrating a lot of small milestones and small wins along the way that way. And I think that combination is really incredible. And to your point as well about the individuals that train multiple times per day. I mean, there was one guy I worked with who was telling me he was trying to train 2, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. And it's like, I hate the term load management, and it's something that comes up a lot, but it's also
yeah,
like you have to be somewhat cognizant about how much and what you're putting your body through that way. I
yeah.
certainly understand the push to be strong and resilient and push through anything and everything, but at the same time, there is a breaking point for things, and you've got to figure out what that looks like for you.
It's different for everybody too. Some people's bodies are just naturally more resilient. They were athletes. They come in with a little bit of larger toolbox, more things they can do. They're a little stronger. Their body's used to, a little bit of abuse or a little bit of physical, you know, engagement. And some people aren't. They literally come off the couch and they're out of shape and they come in, they get addicted to it and they lose weight and actually get really tough. That's the other thing. Like you can have the skinny little kid, take someone that is very athletic but doesn't have as good of a skill set, and technique can beat them. It can win. That's a very unique thing because you wouldn't expect that in jiu-jitsu. And that is empowering to a lot of people. And it's also very, we talked about, addicting. And the other thing about jiu-jitsu is, you get your black belt. I've had my black belt for like 3 or 4 years, 4 years maybe, I don't know. And it's like, oh, I've got my black belt. What now? Like, well, just back to it. I'm still learning. So the thing is, like, you're always learning. You never know it all. There's always a technique or a modification or this or that or a counter. So you're always learning. So the thing is, it's like never ending. So you don't really get bored. Like you're not, you can bore yourself in jiu-jitsu by doing the same old shit over and over. I'm just gonna do the same techniques over and over. But like you can always learn. Like there's a guard pass I learned maybe a couple months ago, and I was like, oh man, that's awesome. It's exciting. I'm gonna start putting that into my game plan, and then you'll get excited again. So it's just like constant learning, which I think as humans we should always be learning, and that's so important. And I think jiu-jitsu does offer that in a certain capacity as well, which is great.
Yeah, 100%. And, as you were talking, and we've talked about the longevity piece and the training piece and so on, and strength training has come up a number of times as well as a key component to trying to help prevent some of these injuries. But, I've talked with some jiu-jitsu athletes in the past who don't really like that concept of strength training because, hey, maybe they rolled for 2 hours earlier that day and, they just don't have it in them to go to the gym, or maybe they just don't necessarily see the carryover from strength training to jujitsu that way. So, how do you kind of like consider that strength and conditioning? What is the actual carryover to jujitsu? Or, this came up in the past on a episode we did with Mike and Bo and Tim and those guys that way, where the concept of weight came up too for athletes that compete that way. And they'll cite, hey, I don't want to pack on too much muscle, or I don't want to get quote unquote too bulky. But, I don't necessarily think that's something that I think that concern is a little bit overemphasized compared to what we can actually do in the gym from a strength training standpoint that way.
It's hard to get bulky. If you're a natural athlete, I'm in my 40s, and like I'm trying to put on muscle, and it's hard. You got to eat a lot. You got to really, really stimulate those muscles. You got to lift heavy. You have to do it in a smart way, an intelligent way, a way that kind of does not impact your jiu-jitsu. So like strength, I mean, it's an advantage to be strong in jiu-jitsu. Like that's all I'm gonna say. Do you want your jiu-jitsu to be better? You need to lift weights. You need to get stronger. Now, yes, you can always overdo it on anything. You can overdo it. You can get huge and very bulky, and then your body doesn't move maybe in a way that is comfortable, or you get too heavy. But I don't know, man. I very rarely see that somebody's like, oh, they're too muscular. Like I'll say it this way. Rarely, and I'm not saying it's impossible, rarely have I seen that somebody goes to the gym and gets stronger and gets better condition and they do worse in jiu-jitsu. Rarely has that been a thing. So I think the education piece of it is so important, that this is a part of your jiu-jitsu. You don't have to go to jiu-jitsu 5, 6 days a week, twice a day to get better. You could go 3, 4 days a week, and then you can lift weights a couple days a week, probably 3 days. For me, ideally three, I think. And you can make your jiu-jitsu significantly better that way. I would argue that maybe training like 4 days a week, I think is good. And then lifting weights 3 days a week. And some people, it could be 3 and 3 and a day off. You would be better. I think your jiu-jitsu would be better that way than training like 6 days a week, twice a day. That's for me. Like, and not for everybody, but like I think that's for me. If you're someone that's all you do is like you're a professional athlete, yes, you can train more. You have more time in your day to recover, to lift weights. Pretty much your whole schedule is built around training jujitsu. But if you're like working a 9 to 5 and you're like, I'm trying in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'm training or whatever, training around work hours, that's going to be too much on your body, I think. And I think that's too much training. I think you would do better with lifting weights and doing the mobility things and recovery piece and all that stuff that will improve your jiu-jitsu more. So it's the education part of
Yeah.
it that's very important. I don't think people, I don't know, they don't relate the two, and that's a really tough thing to do, because all jiu-jitsu people want to do is train jiu-jitsu. That's all they want to do. And if they're injured, they want to train jiu-jitsu. And if they're injured, we talked about, they don't want to go to the doctor because they're afraid the doctor's going to say, what are you doing? Don't do that. Don't come back. I just fixed your knee. You're going to go back and try to, get your knee wrenched on. No, I don't want you training anymore. I just had a call, last week, a guy had a meniscus repair. Doctor's like, you're not going back to jiu-jitsu. I don't think you should go back. I'm like, dude, like the whole point of you have surgery or have a corrective procedure so that you can go back to doing the things that you want to do.
Yeah.
Now you got to be safe about it. You have to have the proper onboarding and returning back. You have to have the proper integration back into jiu-jitsu. And we can talk about that as well, because that's a whole gamut of things. But you can come back, like, and that's the whole point. Like, the whole point is not to go to the doctor and have them do a procedure and say, well, you can't ever go, unless it's like life, like your life is on the line kind of thing. You know what I mean? But that's very rarely the case, unless it's like some kind of heart condition or whatever. But like in that capacity, like having a meniscus repair, which is a serious procedure, takes a lot of time to get back. You got to be mindful and careful, but you should be able to get back with those things.
Yeah, 100% agree. And to the points on strength and conditioning as well, I certainly think there's carryover to jiu-jitsu in my mind, in my opinion. Now, disclaimer, obviously I don't practice jiu-jitsu, so you can take that with a grain of salt if you would like, but it just, from a like scientific standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to me that there would be carryover there. And the other element I think too is like you don't have to get too specific in the gym. I'm sure every time you open up Instagram, you see new like jujitsu drills for the gym and like some crazy variation someone's doing. And it's like, if you want to get quote unquote jujitsu specific or martial arts specific, if you will, squat, but make it like a Zercher squat instead of a back squat. There you go. More sport specific. Check that box. I think a lot of the times just the simple general things done really well. And especially through a full range of motion, if you
There it
can, just
is.
to reinforce those range of motion gains that we talked about before will carry over astronomically well to any kind of sport in the martial arts discipline that way. And I think that's one of the many mistakes that I see people making in the gym is, they go and they're doing the right things, but they either don't have the range of motion or they're biasing one element of the entire piece. They're taking one piece of the pie instead of the whole pie. So, let's take the squat, for example. they'll do a partial range squat and they're not getting the full benefits. Or they'll do the squat, but they'll only do it explosive and fast. And it's like, hey, you could also slow that movement down and control it and really emphasize the eccentric component as well. And I think that if you take the simple things and you actually just play around with them a lot with all of those different variables, you're going to get the most bang for your buck here. And I'd imagine going back to carry over to jiu-jitsu, I'd imagine the same thing is relatively true with the different skills you learn in jiu-jitsu. It's not just do the skill one way. It's like, hey, could I do this slightly different? Or is there something that might work a little bit better the next time I have to do it that way? Or, maybe your go-to move is the triangle and they've got a really good guard against that. So how do I break that if that's my go-to move? Or do I have to go down my list and pick my fifth best move instead because that's their weak spot?
Yeah, I think to your point of lifting, a lot of my lifting is full range of motion, pausing. There's some isometric components. There's some holds. You have to slow. A lot of jujitsu is isometric. A lot of, if I'm like passing guard and I get past your guard, I'm in side control, which is like maybe my chest, you're on bottom and my chest is on your chest. I'm on top. I may squeeze and hold position there. That's not isometric. I'm wrapping my arms maybe around your arms and your shoulders and kind of your torso, and I'm holding. Like I'm trying to hold that. If I have your back, for example, back control, like I'm behind you, I may have a seatbelt grip. So one hand over the shoulder, one hand under the arm, and my hands are together. I'm squeezing, holding. Well, it's not just shoulders, it's back too. Boom. I'm going for submission. I need isometric. I have to be able to have good endurance in some of those aspects. Yeah, I need to be able to explode. I need to be able to push them. I need to be able to hit the gas and then slow down and be able to control. Hit the gas, slow down if that's my game. Some people have a very slow, grindy kind of game. They're just constantly just taking an inch every time they take a little bit, and all of a sudden they're on top of you and you're getting choked, and some people are younger, they're more dynamic and more explosive, and they have a bigger gas tank, but they still have to have the ability to explode and then slow down and control. A lot of jiu-jitsu is about control and limiting space. And so can you control? Can you limit space? Can you be the smaller person and hold the bigger person down? Can you do that? And a lot of that is isometric strength and weight distribution, technique, of course, but that it's easy. I've had, where I'm about 170, 172, and I've rolling with people that are 250, 240, and I'm just a little more skilled than they are, and I'm able to get in a position, hold them down. I've had to where I have a buddy of mine that competes at like 135 pounds. He's gotten on top of me. He's a black belt. He's super tough. He's gotten a side control, and I can't get his ass off me. And I'm bigger, stronger, and I can't move him. And it's like, it's just a lot of that technique and isometric control and that squeeze that you develop, which you can develop some of that through jiu-jitsu, but you also need to develop other things through strength conditioning and mobility work. And so you can have your body in the proper positioning to perform the technique to its most effective state.
Yeah, and if you're doing strength and conditioning correctly, a lot of it is isometric in nature, right? Take the squat example we mentioned before. Yeah, there's movement occurring at the hips, the knees, and the ankles and the feet. And, you mentioned before about neutral spine. I'm, willing to argue that it's very difficult to impossible to actually keep a neutral spine through a full range of motion squat. There's going to be
There's going to
slight
be movement,
flexion occurring.
100%.
But
Yeah.
what else is resisting movement, right? Like if I've got a bar on my back or if I'm in that Zercher position, my shoulders are isometric, my elbows are isometric, and so on. That way, there's enough of an isometric element that I think if done properly, you learn to tense the entire system. Or same thing with the bench, right? Go out there and try and bench press and just do it upper body and then bench press again, but actually brace the entire body, dig the feet into the ground, and actually learn how to like activate as many muscles as possible. You doing that is going to feel drastically different. And the same is true for jiu-jitsu that way. If you have that ability to brace the entire body and fire up the entire system as opposed to only pieces of it, I'd imagine your game is a lot better. And to your point about your 135-pound friend who's able to just kind of like throw you around that way when he's on the side, you can be the smaller guy that wins the fight against the bigger guy that way just because you've got the ability to withstand and withhold forces isometrically in a way that others might not have.
Yeah. And you have technique and skill and positioning and also knowing like, all right, somebody's going to be just use all muscle and all strength. Well, I know when to release, and then when to contract again. I know when to do those things, timing, those type of things. And when you're a smaller grappler, like or the lighter grappler, you know when to do those things. You know when to hold on. You know when to let go. You know when to move, and that comes with obviously. But you got to have the ability to hold and move, and know when to do that and latch on and do those things and isometrically activate. And so like isometrics are a unique thing. They're very versatile, right? You use it for strength, you use it for mobility, to opening up the joint a little more. There's a lot there, and jiu-jitsu has a lot of those elements. And so again, something to for people to think about, and where that's where I think like it's very important to work with somebody that understands these elements of jiu-jitsu and elements of strength conditioning and elements of rehab, because that's what's going to keep you kind of get you back to the mats or keep you on the mats. That's kind of the theme there, like working with somebody. If I was a baseball player, I want to go with somebody that's either played baseball or worked with a significant amount of baseball injuries, that understands the mechanics, pitching and throwing mechanics. Those are so important to understand how the hips and how the legs work, having the proper rotation in the torso, having proper, mobility and in the ankles and the hips and the knees, so I can throw optimally without injuring my shoulder, my joint. Somebody needs to know those things. And like, if I've never thrown a baseball, you're gonna come to me, I'm not gonna know what the hell to do. Oh, we'll just do some rotation and you should be good. But that's not all goes into the mechanics and the sequence and the dynamic movements that go into throwing a baseball, for example. Layer that with jiu-jitsu, where you have literally chokes and submissions to the joints and positioning and control and takedowns, and then all these extraneous variables, because now you're going against somebody that's going to oppose their will and oppose pressure and movements on you. Can you counter that? Can you move properly when you need to? There's a lot of variables in jiu-jitsu. And so that's the point I'm making. There's a lot of stuff that can go awry a little bit. So you just got to work with somebody. You can't go to a regular physical therapist. They can
No,
get you only so
100%.
far. They can get you so far. Initially, yeah, go do your basic rehab stuff, like, your leg raises and blah, blah, blah. Do all your stuff. Get your range of motion back. When they release, that's what I tell people. When your physical therapist has released you, then you call me, and I'm gonna get you from they've released me to, all right, let's get you back on the mats and get you back to training.
Yeah, and to your point, jiu-jitsu by nature is chaotic. The sport
Yeah,
itself is constantly reacting to a changing stimulus, your opponent. So
yeah.
it's very difficult to get that in a controlled environment like a PT clinic. So the PT clinics that I've seen typically check that controlled element, but then we have to progress from control to chaos, which is sport. And the more you break that up into a step-by-step process or framework, if you will, the better I see that going for athletes. And, I don't know that progression nearly as well as you do because I don't have that experience in the sport myself that way. So from your angle, what is that progression from, hey, I've just got this athlete who's going to start working with me. They're discharged from, run-of-the-mill PT clinic to now they're back to jiu-jitsu unrestricted. I don't have to worry about them. What do some of those key highlights or steps along that journey look like to you?
So my practice is I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, so I will see people in the office, and sometimes we'll go to the gym, and I'll take them to the gym. We'll do some movements and things like that. But a lot of times, I'll see them that way or online. I'll do some online. I do online coaching, so I'll have people reach out, and we'll set up a time, and I'm going to take them through a movement screen that I feel that they need to be able to do. So we have to have certain prerequisites, certain things that somebody needs to be able to do in jiu-jitsu. A simple one, let's use a simple one, is a full squat, like a squat, deep squat. Or if you're kneeling or like sitting back on your heels, you have to be able to sit back on your heels. Because if you can't do that, then somebody's going to force you into that position. You're going to be in that position when you're in closed guard. You're sitting closed guard and you're sitting in somebody's guard. You're probably going to be sitting back on your heels. You have to be able to, a deep squatted position. You have to be in that for guard passing, even like a deep lunge position. You have to be in those are some of the prerequisites. So we would go through a movement assessment. Let me see what your rotation is. Can you flex? Can you, a lot of times I'll do that through controlled articular rotations, which is a rotational kind of assessment. It's a joint training that we do, and you can use that as an assessment. You can use it as a maintenance tool to help keep your joints healthy and even as a warm up technique. So I'll do a lot of, I take them through specific movements. We'll figure out, do you have any pain or any closing angle dysfunction, which is like if the joint is like we're closing down the joint, you're having pain in the closing angle. So that's something we may need to address. Obviously pain's got to be something we have to, clear as well. And pain's not the most important thing. Just because you don't have pain doesn't mean you're healed or you're ready to go back, and vice versa. If your pain is fairly well controlled, that's an important piece. That is, but like having resting pain's a problem, but that's something, otherwise we can address. But like I would just make sure their symptoms are well managed. I would check their range of motion. I discuss with them like what's your game plan? What do you like to do in jiu-jitsu? What do you want to get into jiu-jitsu? And then we'll go from there. Obviously we'll set up a treatment plan or like a game plan for coming back. And then you basically, a way to say is we start with gently removing like the variables. There's a lot of variables in jiu-jitsu. We try to remove a lot of the variables. So maybe you start with solo drilling, you do that for a bit. Get comfortable. Does your body feel comfortable? Can you do it? Can you get in the positions properly by yourself without any external stimulus, nobody pushing, resisting you? Then, okay, cool. Let's go find somebody you trust. Maybe the next element is you're going to go and you're just going to do class. You're going to run through techniques, make sure you feel safe, someone your size, someone you trust, someone that moves similar to you, your similar skill set. Then we start to add those things in. Well, then we do positional sparring, or we do, you're only going to start from this position. You're going to go past defend drills or whatever. We try to eliminate a lot of these variables, and then we add them in slowly, and we integrate that and get somebody feeling confident, because that's a big thing too, is like somebody feeling like they're confident and stuff. And then in the meantime, we're doing mobility work, we're doing strength conditioning, we're doing prescription stuff. But those are some of the ways that we would kind of integrate and come back to training. But first and foremost, I want you to, number one, be cleared by your physician and be cleared by your physical therapist that maybe you start working with for this initial rehab process. The dangerous part is that a lot of the physicians or the physical therapists don't understand what the requirements of jiu-jitsu are, and they'll just say, yeah, you're good to go back. Yep. Oh, you can jump. Your single leg hop test or your triple hop test is this and that. Boom. Go back. Cool. And they'll release these people to go back to jiu-jitsu, and jiu-jitsu people they will take that and run with it. And they'll say, oh, I'm good to go back. I've been out for 6 months, 5 months, whatever. They said I'm good to go. I'm done with therapy. And they go back full bore. They're not ready. They get re-injured, and then you hate to see it. It does happen. So you have to have someone that can guide you and tell you, hey, all right, here's some research. Here's some of the risk factors. You could get, we got to get you back gradually. I don't want you off the mats anymore. I want you there. And even if you're injured initially and you come to see me, the last thing I want to do is take you off the mats. I want to have you train in some capacity. And that's the big fear we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, is these athletes are afraid of the doctor because they don't want to hear you can't train or you need to stop training. Go sit at home and rest. It's so insane to me. Well, okay, so you've injured your shoulder. Cool. Well, let's go work your legs. Let's do some type of squatting, lunging. Let's get you stronger. Let's do something. Like, don't just sit around, and it's isolating, and it's scary to some of these athletes because they use jiu-jitsu as a physical and then a mental release. And it's so important for their well-being to be on the mats in some capacity. And so there's a fear there as well. And it's an education for the physicians and the physical therapists that don't really understand jiu-jitsu. And it's an education for the athletes as well that, hey, we're not all out here trying to take you off the mats. My goal is to get you on the mats as soon as possible and keep you there.
Right. It's giving the control and the autonomy back to the athlete
Yeah.
as opposed to
Yeah.
keeping it in the hands of the medical system. And the other piece that I think is often missed in the medical system with that is I want those athletes to be back in that jiu-jitsu gym as early as possible. Now that might not necessarily be them drilling, but I want them there
Yeah.
around people that they know, that they form connections with. And if nothing else, yeah, it might suck to sit there and watch, but let me tell you what, I've seen a lot of good come from working with athletes that are actually able to be there in person and watch things and kind of walk through mentally in their head, what steps would I take? What would I do if I was in that person's position? Because once your body kind of mentally figures it out, when it comes time to actually physically do it, you've gotten like months and months of mental reps in instead of
Yeah.
trying to go from scratch.
Mental reps matter. They
They
matter.
do.
We had this guy, he's actually a doctor. I think he's an ER doc, and he was a judo like national champion, maybe he's won some big titles, and he came in on the podcast. And he's like, yeah, I'd be walking down, like I could only train because my work schedule was so crazy. He started getting into jiu-jitsu as well. But he did judo and a lot of no-gi judo, so without the kimono. And he's like, dude, I'd literally walk down the hall at the hospital and do like foot trips and practice stuff. And like literally and going through my head over and over. And like when I would train, I would hit the technique. Now he's extremely high level. He's got such an understanding of technique, but like that's just an extreme example. But you're doing those mental reps and you're visualizing. He would just visualize and kind of walk down the hall and do these movements, and he would be able to hit the techniques, which is crazy. But it is very much there's some importance, and also being in the environment, being around people helps you at least have that connection to the gym. Because if you're a lot of the white belts and the beginners, um, they get injured and then they kind of fall off. You're like, oh, you lose that connection to the gym, or they get injured and then they stop for a bit, but they come back and they get re-injured again because they didn't reintegrate themselves properly. Because like, I'm ready to train, and they go in, they get hurt again, and they're out again, and then that's how you lose them, and that's how they maybe never come back, is because they just kind of dealt with a string of injuries that kept them off the mats, and they lose that connection to jiu-jitsu and that connection to the gym. So you try to protect those newer grapplers, and you try to make sure you educate them again, like we talked about, and try to mitigate those because they'll do some dumb stuff. I did dumb stuff. I remember as a white belt, like this guy had me in an arm bar, and I literally had him hanging off my shoulder, off my arm. I picked him up. He was a big dude because I didn't want to tap. And I remember the coach looked at the guy that had my arm, and he's like, let him go. And luckily he did that because, I mean, it was so stupid. Like, we do stupid stuff. Like, we don't want to give up for any reason. It's just practice. It's okay. It's okay to tap. Don't get hurt. But, like, we'll do some dumb shit. I did it. I'm speaking from experience. I've got plenty of years on the mats. I'm speaking from experience. I've had dumb injuries. I've done a lot of dumb stuff. And it's just, you've got to protect yourself and be smart about your body.
And I'd imagine that almost becomes part of that return to sport element and the difference that you would see when working with someone who might be newer, like a white belt or a blue belt, compared to someone who's like a brown or a black belt, for
Yeah.
example, right? Like the difference you get when working with someone to return them to the sport when they're seasoned and been there for 10 plus years versus it's year one or year two for them.
Yeah, I give them a lot more like positions, your body, when you're in danger, if you're like a, purple, brown, black, even some blue belts are very, very, very skilled, which is crazy now, just how skilled, like even like the people were not as good. Like when I started, I was like, shit, I'm like no basic stuff. Like I was like, these like newer belts would have killed me when I started. It's just jujitsu's evolved so much. That's kind of the point I'm making. And there wasn't as many people in it. But like, yeah, you give if you're a beginner, like I'm gonna probably give you a little more. The guardrails are gonna be a little, I'm gonna give you less wiggle room. And then if you're more experienced, brown, black, jujitsu, positioning, you're gonna know this feels good, this doesn't. We're still gonna follow some of the same rules of integrating you back, but I'm gonna maybe take the training wheels off a little bit more and let you work a little bit because I trust that you are gonna when your body's more vulnerable or more in a safer position.
Yeah, 100%. That makes a
Yep.
lot of sense that way. And I think that would apply to pretty much any kind of sporting discipline. And I think
Yep.
a lot of people are going to hear that and they're like, oh, that Makes sense.
Yeah.
And I feel like
Yeah.
we could probably talk about this all day long and
Sure.
still
Yeah.
only hit, a surface level of the considerations that go into working with a jiu-jitsu athlete or different things that the jiu-jitsu athlete might want to consider when it comes to their own training or their return to sport and rehab process and so on that way. I know
Yeah.
you've got a ton of online resources and different
Yeah.
things that you offer to help with that. Where can people find you at online to learn more?
So I've got some so jujitsu therapist at .com, and then I have on there I've got, you can reach out to me through email, or kind of there's like you can send me an email if you want to work with me through online coaching. And that's kind of like I do a monthly kind of coaching thing where basically we do an initial meeting, and we'll do the an hour. We do that assessment, we do the mobility, we kind of get your goals in line, and then we start to basically progress you that way, and we'll just get you back to training. We're constantly advancing and modifying your programming just to what your needs are. And then I have, if you're someone that's like, hey, I like to kind of do my own thing, I've got some, I call it grappling RX. That's kind of like my rehab programming. And I've got some stuff I got some warm ups in there, just stuff that I like to do. I've got a shoulder course, an elbow, a knee course that I released not too long ago. And it's basically like, hey, here's the beginning stuff. You've tweaked your knee, or your knee's just been kind of feeling funky for a while, or you've got like a minor or like a moderate-ish sprain. You want to get back to training. All right, so here's like, let's start with week one. I'm going to take you through the sequence. They're all like video courses and stuff like that. It'll take you from the beginning stages of getting range of motion back to strengthening to drills and return to training. So that's all in there. It's at jujitsutherapist.com. And yeah, it's stuff I've kind of, it's the stuff that I'd utilize with my athletes, that I've kind of like, this is the stuff that works. This is the stuff that I use. And this is what's helped people get back to, get their mobility back and their strength back. Cause there's a lot of all that stuff's in there. It's difficult for it to be super specific, but if someone's got some general pain and some mobility issues in one of your joints, like it'll get you there. Like if you followed along and kind of listen to your body, and you're someone that understands how your body moves, you have to have some understanding. And the other thing, which was kind of unintentional with some of these courses, is I've had non physical therapists that aren't really athletes, or not jujitsu athletes at all, and they're working with jujitsu people because there's no one around. Maybe they're in some kind of area where there's not really someone that trains jujitsu that's a physical therapist or a rehab provider. So I'm like, hey, I'll give them some info, but also I'm like, if you want to know how to rehab this knee to get him back to, you want to learn some drills, you can purchase one of the courses, grab the course, and like it's gotta, like, you can literally as a PT take them through these things that I've got. And I didn't intend it that way, but like some people, I'm like, they've purchased some of the courses and stuff. And then Mike Pekarsky, Dr. Kickass, we have something on BJJ Fanatics, which is called the Mat Return. I met Mike, and he flew down to Louisville, and we filmed a bunch of stuff where there's joint mobility, there's self-assessment. Like it's more or less like drills, solo drills, partner drills, and a lot of return to sport testing that we use. So you can actually test your knee and say, is my knee good enough to go back? Again, we recommend always like being cleared by a physical therapist as well. But there's a way you can test your joints, like test your upper extremities, lower extremities. There's ways you can do that. And that's called the Mat Return. That's on BJJ Fanatics. So that's something Mike and I actually filmed. And Mike and I trained together. Mike's super tough. He's a legit black belt, knows his stuff as well. Good dude. And I enjoyed spending some time with him and filming with him. And yeah, so some of that. But jujitsutherapist.com is where you can find some of those.
Yeah, that's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite
Appreciate it.
catch it, you can just click there. And I think if they want to find the podcast that you co-host too, right? Jiu-Jitsu, I think it is. They can find that
Yeah.
on your website as well, correct?
Yeah. So my coach Chewy's a black belt as well. Of course, he's been a black belt for quite a while. High level competitor, good dude. One of my buddies. We've been running the Jiu-Jitsu podcast for 6 years, 7 years, and we talk about strength conditioning. We talk about some of the quirks in jiu-jitsu. We interview some high level athletes and strength conditioning coaches and just all kinds of people. It's all about jiu-jitsu and kind of learning about you. So if you're a beginner, not a beginner, and you're like, hey, I want to learn more about jiu-jitsu and learn about just kind of the intricacies of some of this stuff and some fun stories and some silliness that we do. It's pretty, kind of off the cuff. We're just kind of having fun, enjoying it, and we've been doing it for a long time. But that's something that I do. I love doing. I love podcasting, and it's a rewarding thing, and just the enjoyable parts of learning, right? You get to meet people and talk to them and pick their brains and learn from them as well. So that's the Jiu-Jitsu podcast. And yeah, and just another thing on if you want to follow me on social media or kind of see some of that stuff, contact me that way. That's a lot of times an easier way as well. On social media, it's on Instagram, it's the Jiu-Jitsu therapist.
That's awesome. We'll link to that in the description as well, too, man. Eugene, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I really
Thank you, brother.
appreciate all the insights that you shared in relation to jiu-jitsu that way. I really appreciate your time, man, and looking forward to working again with you in the future here.
That's awesome, Dan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for having me on the podcast. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it. It's fun to be on the other side of things, just answering the questions, not just the one asking them all the time. And yeah, you're doing great stuff. I've listened to a good number of your episodes, and I really enjoy the in-depth knowledge and some of the guests you have. Just a lot of good stuff.